The thing on the floor of the detention cell was not a Kethar anymore. Jake gripped his plasma wrench so tight his knuckles were white bone under the skin. The air in the corridor of Outpost Epsilon smelled wrong. Not the usual recycled oxygen and faint scent of ozone, but something thick and coppery, like an old penny held in a sweaty fist. The Kethar prisoner, a 7-foot-tall warrior with skin like granite and 4 arms, had been screaming for 3 hours. The sound had echoed through the metal decks, a high, thin wail that wasn't about pain. It was about change. Then, 15 minutes ago, the screaming had stopped. Colonel Eva Rostova had sent Jake down to check the cell's power conduit. A lie. A stupid lie. The conduits were fine. She just didn't want to send one of her precious Marines. She wanted a disposable maintenance tech to be the first set of eyes. Jake was disposable. He knew it. He was 42, divorced, and fixing toilets on a rock, 20 million miles from anything that felt like home. He peered through the reinforced plexiglass of the cell door. The prisoner lay in the center of the small, white room. Its gray, rock-like skin was slick and pink in patches, raw and new. One of its lower arms was gone, not torn off. It was just gone. The flesh smoothed over as if it had never been there. The other lower arm was shrinking, withering into a twitching stump. Its powerful legs, built for leaping across the crags of its homeworld, were shorter, thicker. The bones were bending, reshaping themselves under the skin with soft, wet cracks that Jake could almost feel in his own teeth. But the head was the worst part. The Kethar's proud, crested skull was collapsing inward. The intelligent, golden eyes were now wide, black and vacant. Its jaw was unhinging, stretching into a primitive, gaping maw. A low gurgle escaped its throat, a sound that belonged in a swamp, not a starship. It was devolving. Right there on the sterile white floor, the pinnacle of Kethar evolution, a species that had built cities among the stars, was sliding backward down the evolutionary ladder. It was becoming an animal. A stupid, simple animal. Jake fumbled for his comm unit, his hand shaking. "Colonel, this is Jake. You need to see this. You need to get Dr. Aris down here right now." Rostova's voice crackled back, sharp and impatient. "What is it, technician? Did the prisoner expire?" Jake swallowed, the coppery smell catching in his throat. He watched as the creature on the floor dragged itself a few inches forward, its remaining 3 hands clawing uselessly at the smooth floor. Its spine was arching, becoming more pronounced, more reptilian. "No, Colonel," Jake whispered, his eyes locked on the horrifying transformation. "It didn't expire. It's worse. Much, much worse. It's forgetting how to be a Kethar." A shudder ran through the creature's body. Its back legs kicked, then drew up underneath it. It was trying to crouch, like a lizard, like something that had crawled out of the primordial ooze. For a moment, one of its black, soulless eyes met Jake's through the plexiglass. There was nothing in it. No hate, no fear, no intelligence. Just a blank, hungry slate. Humanity had been at war with the Kethar for a decade. We'd fought them with lasers, with plasma, with kinetics. We'd never done this. Nobody had ever done this. This wasn't war. This was erasure. Dr. Aris was a small man with glasses that were always smudged. He looked more like an accountant than a chief medical officer. But his hands were steady as he ran the bioscanner over the cell's interior from the safety of the corridor. The readings projected onto the wall in flickering blue light, a cascade of data that made Jake's head swim. Colonel Rostova stood behind them, her arms crossed, her face a mask of hardened disbelief. "The cellular decay is off the charts," Aris murmured. pushing his glasses up his nose. But it's not decay. It's reorganization. The genetic markers are simplifying. Telomeres shortening at an impossible rate, but the chromosome structure is reverting. It's like watching a film in reverse, but on a biological level. "Speak English, Doctor," Rostova snapped. Her voice was like gravel. Aris took a deep breath. "It's regressing, Colonel. The Caithar's DNA is unwriting itself. The complex gene sequences that code for higher brain function, for its unique four-limbed anatomy, they're being deleted, replaced by older, more primitive code that was dormant in its genome. It's turning into one of its own evolutionary ancestors." Inside the cell, the creature had stopped moving. It lay flat on its belly, its single remaining upper arm splayed out. The other had been fully absorbed into its torso. Its skin was no longer gray but a mottled, sickly green-brown like pond scum. It breathed in shallow, wet gulps. "An ancestor," Rostova scoffed, but there was a tremor of fear in her voice. "You're telling me it's turning into a space monkey?" "Something far older than that, I'm afraid," Aris said, pointing a trembling finger at the display. "Based on these markers, the biological baseline it's approaching is amphibian. Or maybe reptilian. Something that crawled, not walk." Jake felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He remembered the Caithar warrior from 2 days ago, when they'd brought him in. It had stood tall, its golden eyes filled with a warrior's pride even in defeat. It had spoken, its voice a low rumble, quoting its species honor codes. Now it was just a thing. A collection of primitive urges twitching on a cold floor. "This is impossible," Rostova said, shaking her head. "No disease does this, no weapon." "It's not a conventional weapon," Aris countered, his voice low. "This is biological. A retrovirus, perhaps. Something that hijacks the host's cellular machinery and forces it to read its own genetic history backward. The level of sophistication is staggering, terrifying." Jake thought about the war. The Caithar were tough. They were honorable in their own rigid way. They didn't use bioweapons. Their entire philosophy was based on the strength of the warrior, the purity of combat. Humanity, on the other hand, humanity got desperate. We got clever, and when we got clever and desperate, we got ugly. "There are 2 other Caithar prisoners," Rostova said, her gaze hard on him. "Cell block BC heck on them. Now." She pointed at 2 Marines who had been standing guard, their faces pale. The Marines nodded and jogged down the intersecting corridor. Jake stayed put, unable to tear his eyes from the thing in the cell. It was a monster, but it was a monster someone had made. He had a sudden, vivid memory of being a kid, finding a frog and pulling its legs off just to see what would happen. The guilt had been a hot, sick feeling in his stomach. He felt that same sickness now, magnified 1,000 times. A scream echoed from cell block B. It wasn't a Caithar scream. It was human. A young man's shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. Rostova and Aris exchanged a look of dawning horror. The colonel grabbed her sidearm from its holster. "Jake, you stay here. Seal this corridor." But Jake didn't move. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't some freak mutation. It was a plague, and it was just getting started. The thing on the floor twitched, and a long, forked tongue, black as tar, flickered from its mouth to taste the air. The scene in cell block B was chaos painted in blood and bewilderment. One of the Marines was huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, his eyes wide and unseeing. The other stood frozen, his rifle aimed at the cell door, his knuckles white. Inside, The two other Cathar prisoners were undergoing the same hideous metamorphosis. One was further along than the creature in Jake's corridor. It had lost all its arms, and its head had flattened into a spade shape. Its body was elongating, the vertebrae in its spine popping and shifting as it grew longer, more serpentine. The other was just beginning its transformation. It thrashed against the walls, one of its lower arms already withered to a twig, its intelligent eyes clouded with the fog of unknowing. It slammed its changing body against the plexiglass, leaving streaks of pink, raw flesh on the transparent wall. It was a symphony of biological horror, and Jake felt like he was going to be sick. "It's the same," Dr. Aris said, his voice barely a whisper. He had his scanner out again, but he wasn't even looking at the data. He was just staring at the writhing thing that was once a soldier. The same regressive pattern. Colonel Rostova had regained her composure. The soldier had replaced the scared woman. "Quarantine, full base lockdown. Nobody in or out. I want level 4 biohazard protocols enacted immediately. Get me a secure channel to High Command. Scramble it on a triple encryption key." Her orders were sharp, precise. The Marines, jolted from their terror, began to move. Comms crackled to life. Red lights began to flash silently along the corridors, and a heavy thud of bulkhead door sealing echoed through the outpost. The air suddenly felt thicker, more claustrophobic. They were trapped on a metal island with a monster that used to be their enemy. Jake was supposed to be a maintenance tech. He was supposed to fix pipes and rewire panels. Now he was standing in the middle of a biological nightmare, feeling utterly useless. He watched Dr. Aris work, watched Rostova bark orders, and he felt a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with the devolved aliens. It was the speed of it, the efficiency. This wasn't a random outbreak. It was an attack. A weapon had been deployed. But how? The prisoners had been in isolation for a week. No contact. The air was filtered. The food was synthesized. "Colonel," Jake said, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure why he was speaking. He was just a grease monkey. But the question was burning in his mind. How could it have infected all three of them? They're in separate sealed sections. Rostova turned to him, her eyes narrowed. For a second, he thought she was going to tell him to shut up and get back to his station. But she hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "The water supply," Dr. Aris suggested without looking up. "The nutrient paste they're fed. We synthesize it separately for Cathar biology," Rostova countered. "The systems are isolated from our own. We checked them this morning, standard procedure." Jake's mind, used to tracing circuits and following pipes, started working. He saw the outpost not as corridors and rooms, but as a system of interconnected veins and arteries. Power, water, air, data, it all flowed. "The air isn't completely isolated," Jake said, thinking aloud. "The final stage atmospheric scrubbers in the detention block are all linked to a central reclamation unit. Unit 7. It's an old model. The filters are good, but if something was small enough, a microorganism." Aris looked up, his eyes wide behind the smudged lenses. "A virus. A tailored airborne vector. It would have to be incredibly virulent. It would have saturated the entire detention block's atmosphere in hours." Rostova's face went pale. The ventilation system. Seal it. Seal it now. But Jake knew it was too late. The air they were breathing right now had passed through the same ducts. They had been breathing it for hours. The thought made his skin crawl. He looked at his own hands, half expecting to see his fingers start to shrink, to fuse together. It was designed for physiology, right, Doctor? One of the Marines asked, his voice shaking. It can't affect humans. Right. Dr. Eris didn't answer. He just stared at the Cathar prisoner as it finally stopped flashing. It lay coiled on the floor, its new serpentine body slick with amniotic fluid. It looked like a giant skinless snake. It had forgotten arms, legs, language, honor. It had forgotten everything. All it knew now was the floor, the air, and the gnawing, ancient emptiness in its belly. An emptiness that would soon become hunger. Rostova finally got her secure line to High Command. Jake watched as she spoke into the comm, her back to them. Her voice was low, but he could hear the tension in it. He saw her shoulders stiffen. She went silent for a long time, just listening. Then she spoke 2 words, her voice filled with a dawning, soul-crushing understanding. "Eden Protocol," she whispered into the comm. And then she slowly turned to look at them, her face as white as a ghost. Oh God, it was us. The name hung in the air like poison gas. Eden Protocol. It sounded so clean, so biblical. A return to the garden, a fresh start. But seeing what was happening in the cells, Jake understood the horrible, twisted meaning. It wasn't about creating a new Eden. It was about uncreating an old one. It was about taking a species that had reached for the stars and casting it back into the mud. Us, Dr. Eris stammered, his face ashen. High Command authorized this? A weapon that does this? Colonel Rostova lowered the comm unit, her hand trembling slightly. The iron mask was gone, replaced by a look of profound shock. It's a black project, top secret. A psychological weapon, they called it. A non-lethal solution to the Cathar problem. They said it was species-specific. A retrovirus keyed to unique Cathar genetic markers. It was never supposed to be deployed without a direct presidential order. Then what is it doing here? Jake asked, his voice flat. He felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes after the worst has already happened. Someone leaked it, or stole it, deployed it here in our outpost as a test, Rostova said, her gaze distant, to see if it worked. They were a lab experiment. The prisoners, the guards, Jake, the colonel herself. Just rats in a cage, and someone was watching from the other side of the glass to see if the poison took. The thought was so cold, so clinical, it made Jake's stomach clench. This wasn't an act of war by an enemy. This was a field test by their own side. The comms officer who decrypted the signal said the deployment vector was a high-frequency burst. Rostova continued, her voice gaining a hard edge again as she processed the information. Transmitted to the station 2 days ago. It wasn't in the air or the water. It was a signal. A frequency that activates dormant nanites. Dr. Eris looked horrified. Nanotechnology? Microscopic machines delivered through what? Inoculations. Standard supply shipments. They could have been in our bodies for years. Rostova finished, her eyes sweeping over all of them, lying dormant, waiting for the trigger signal. The signal broadcast on this station was keyed for the Cathar. It activated the nanites in their bodies and started the regression. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The simultaneous infections. The lack of a physical contaminant. It was the perfect silent weapon. A poison you could deliver with a radio wave. Jake felt a phantom itch under his skin. He thought about the yearly physicals, the mandatory vaccinations. Had they been seeded with these microscopic monsters? Programmed to rewrite his very being on command. He looked at his hands again. They seemed alien to him, a temporary arrangement of flesh and bone that could be repossessed at any moment. "So we're safe then," the young Marine said, a desperate hope in his voice. The signal was for them, not for us. Before Aris or Rostova could answer, a new sound came from down the main corridor. A choking, gasping noise. It was Corporal Davies, one of the men who had been stationed at the main security junction. A big, friendly man who always had a picture of his daughter taped to his monitoring station. They found him on his knees, clutching his throat. His face was beet red, his eyes bulging. "Can't breathe," he rasped. Dr. Aris rushed to his side. "What is it, Corporal? What's wrong?" "Fingers," numb Davies choked out. He held up a hand. It was shaking violently. The corporal's fingers seemed thicker, stubbier than they had been a minute ago. The fingernails were yellowing, growing coarse and hard. "The virus," Aris breathed, backing away slowly. "It's not as species-specific as they thought. Or it's mutating. The nanites are adapting." Davies let out a guttural cry. It wasn't a human sound. It was deeper, more bestial. He fell forward onto his hands, and they heard a distinct wet crunch as the bones in his wrists and knuckles shifted. His skin, normally pale from the recycled station light, was flushing a deep, mottled red. The hair on his arms was growing thicker, coarser, turning into a wiry, dark bristle. He was devolving. But it was different from the Cathar. The Cathar regression was a clean slide backward into a primitive form. Davies's transformation was a chaotic mess. His human DNA didn't have a simple linear path to follow. It was a jumble of evolutionary dead ends and forgotten branches. He wasn't becoming an ape or a reptile. He was becoming a nightmare. A collage of failed mutations. The Marine, who had been hoping they were safe, let out a small, terrified whimper. Corporal Davies lifted his head. His jaw was distorting, elongating. His teeth were becoming sharper, more pointed. But the worst part was his eyes. Behind the pain and the confusion, there was a glimmer of his old self. A terrified human being trapped inside a body that was betraying him in the most fundamental way imaginable. He looked at Jake, his gaze a silent, desperate plea. Then the glimmer was gone, replaced by a flat, predatory cunning. A low growl rumbled in his chest. The Eden Protocol had breached containment. And now, the garden was growing monsters of its own. The transformation of Corporal Davies was fast and ugly. His spine bowed, forcing him into a permanent hunched crouch. His knuckles thickened, dragging on the floor as he moved. The skin on his back split open, and rudimentary cartilage-like spikes pushed their way out with wet, tearing sounds. He was a biological train wreck, a horrifying mix of man and beast that evolution had never intended. Colonel Rostova raised her sidearm. Her hand was steady, but her face was a canvas of revulsion and a terrible grim pity. "Davies," she said, her voice strained. "Corporal, can you hear me?" The creature that was once Davies let out a wet snarl. It scraped a hand, now more of a clawed paw, across the metal deck, leaving 4 deep gouges in the floor. Its eyes, now slitted in yellow, fixed on the nearest Marine. It was pure predator. The man inside was gone, buried under a landslide of primal DNA. "Don't shoot," Dr. Aris yelled, stepping in front of the colonel. "He might be contagious through blood spatter. We don't know." "Get out of the way, Doctor," Rostova commanded. "That thing is not one of my men anymore." "But it's our only chance to study the human vector," Aris pleaded, his scientific curiosity warring with his survival instinct. "We need a sample. We need to know how it's different." The Davies thing chose that moment to lunge. It moved with a clumsy but terrifying speed, a shambling, powerful gait. It wasn't aiming for the colonel or the doctor. It launched itself at the petrified young Marine, the one who had been so sure they were safe. Jake acted without thinking. He swung the heavy plasma wrench in his hand like a baseball bat, putting all his weight behind it. The solid metal tool connected with the side of the creature's head with a sickening crack. It wasn't a hero's blow. It was a desperate, panicked swing. The creature staggered, a grunt of pain and surprise escaping its throat. It turned its malformed head toward Jake, its yellow eyes burning with a sudden focused hatred. "Seal the corridor. Now," Rostova screamed into her comm. A heavy bulkhead door began to descend with a hydraulic hiss, trapping them in the section with the creature. "Jake, get back." The Davies thing ignored her. It saw Jake, the one who had hurt it, and it charged again. Jake scrambled backward, tripping over a loose power conduit. He fell hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him. The creature was on him in a second, its weight crushing, its breath hot and foul, smelling of blood and rot. A clawed hand swiped at his face. He threw his arm up, and the claws raked across his forearm, tearing through his jumpsuit and leaving deep, burning furrows in his skin. Pain sharp and electric shot up his arm. He cried out, kicking and squirming under the monster's weight. He could see its face, the distorted features, the sharpened teeth snapping just inches from his throat. This was it. This was how he died, torn apart by a man he'd shared coffee with yesterday. A series of rapid concussive blasts echoed in the narrow corridor. The creature's body jerked, then went rigid. Blue-white energy holes appeared in its back. It shuddered once, then collapsed on top of Jake, a dead, twitching weight. Colonel Rostova stood over them, her plasma pistol smoking. She had fired on the stun setting, but at point-blank range it was lethal. Two Marines helped Jake pull the heavy body off him. He sat up gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the deep scratches on his arm. Blood was welling up, dark and thick. Dr. Aris rushed over, his face pale with alarm. "He broke your skin. The contagion could be in your bloodstream." Jake stared at his bleeding arm, then at the dead thing on the floor. The Eden Protocol was in him. The thought was a block of ice in his gut. Were the nanites already waking up? Were they swimming through his veins, looking for the switches to flip, the genes to rewrite? He felt a sudden terrifying itch, a tingling under his skin that was probably just his imagination, but felt horribly, vividly real. "Get him to the med bay," Rostova ordered, her voice grim. "Isolate him now." Jake looked from the colonel's hard face to the doctor's terrified one. He was no longer Jake, the maintenance tech. He was a contamination risk. He was patient zero. As the Marines helped him to his feet, he looked back at the corpse of Corporal Davies. Its dead yellow eyes seemed to stare right at him, a final terrible warning. The devolution in humans wasn't a clean regression. It was a chaotic explosion of biological horror. And now, that chaos was inside him. A ticking time bomb waiting for the signal to detonate. The medbay was a sterile white box that felt more like a prison cell. Dr. Aris had put him in an isolation chamber, a room within a room, separated by a thick wall of plexiglass. He kept looking at his hands, expecting the fingers to shorten, the knuckles to swell. He felt like a man who had been told there was a bomb in the room, but not when it was set to go off. Through the glass, he could see Aris and Rostova arguing. Their voices were muffled, but their body language spoke volumes. Eris was frantic, pointing at a monitor displaying Jake's blood work, then at Jake himself. Rostova was rigid, her arms crossed, shaking her head. The calm professionalism of the outpost was shattering, replaced by raw, primal fear. Lena, the comms officer, appeared. She was young, maybe 25, with sharp, intelligent eyes that always seemed to see more than she let on. She handed a data slate to Rostova, who glanced at it and cursed. Rostova looked through the glass at Jake, her expression unreadable. Then she and Lena walked away, leaving Aris alone. Aris approached the glass, his face etched with worry. He tapped a control, and a speaker crackled to life. "Jake, how are you feeling?" "Like a bug in a jar, Doc," Jake said, his voice flat. "Any changes? Am I growing a tail yet?" Aris winced. "Your blood work is anomalous. The nanites are present. They're active, but they don't seem to be initiating the full regression sequence. It's like they're trying to, but your DNA is fighting back, causing errors. Unpredictable cellular mutations are happening on a microscopic level. It's not devolution, it's just chaos." "So what does that mean?" Jake asked, dreading the answer. "I don't know," Aris admitted, and the honesty was more terrifying than any lie. "It could mean nothing. It could mean the nanites will eventually burn themselves out. Or it could mean your transformation will be even more unstable than Davis's. We just don't know." A klaxon suddenly blared through the outpost. A shrill, piercing sound. A computerized voice, devoid of emotion, echoed from the speakers. "Warning. Biohazard breach in Sector Gamma. All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones." Warning. Sector Gamma. That was the mess hall. "What's going on?" Jake yelled, standing up. Aris was already turning away, his face a mask of horror. "Oh no, someone else is infected." The next few hours were a blur of panicked voices, over the comms of distant screams, and the heavy thud of more bulkheads sealing. The outpost was turning into a maze, a tomb. Jake was trapped in his glass box, a helpless observer to the station's death throes. Lena came back later. She bypassed the main controls and spoke to him on a private channel, her voice a hushed whisper. "They are not telling you everything, Jake." "What aren't they telling me?" The colonel got another message from High Command. It wasn't a rescue plan. It was an order. Protocol Scythe. They've written off the outpost. They've declared it a total loss. In 6 hours, a military drone is going to fire a cleansing charge at the station. It will vaporize everything, us included. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. They weren't going to be rescued. They were going to be erased, executed by their own side to keep the secret of the Eden Protocol from ever getting out. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "Because you were right about the air scrubbers," Lena said. "And you're a problem solver. Rostova's plan is to bunker down and pray. Aris's plan is to find a cure in 6 hours. Both are insane. I think our only chance is the SSV Nomad." The Nomad. A small, long-range emergency shuttle docked in the station's secondary hangar bay. It was a lifeboat. "The hangars are on the other side of the station," Jake said. "We'd have to go through half the base. We don't know how many more are changing." "3 more so far," Lena said, her voice grim. "They're faster than Davies was. The nanites are adapting, learning. But the Nomad is our only shot. The hangar is shielded." The cleansing charge might not penetrate it if we can get the ship's own shields online. But I can't get there alone. I need you. Jake looked down at his bandaged arm. The bleeding had stopped, but a deep, throbbing ache remained. He was a time bomb, a monster in waiting. Why me? I'm infected, Lena. I could change at any second. I know, she said, their eyes meeting his through the glass. And in them, he didn't see fear. He saw a desperate, calculated gamble. But you're also the only one who's been up close with one of those things and survived. You're a maintenance tech. You know the station's layout, the service tunnels, the back ways. Rostova and her Marines only know the main corridors. Right now, being a simple grease monkey might be the most valuable skill on this station. We have 6 hours, Jake. Are you in? Jake looked at the sterile white walls of his cell. He could die here, waiting for a cure that would never come. He could die here waiting for a fire that would burn his very atoms. Or he could die out there fighting for a chance, no matter how small. He looked at his hands. They were still his. For now. Get me out of this box, he said. Lena was efficient. A few keystrokes on her personal data slate, and the magnetic lock on the isolation chamber hissed open. Jake stepped out, the air of the medbay, feeling strange and open after the confines of the glass box. His arm throbbed, a constant dull reminder of his personal time bomb. Dr. Aris was gone, presumably trying to work his scientific magic against a ticking clock. The medbay was deserted, except for the two of them. The distant sounds of chaos had faded, replaced by an eerie listening silence. Rostova has the remaining Marines fortifying the command center, Lena said, handing Jake a data slate with a schematic of the outpost on it. She thinks she can ride out the storm. She's wrong. The two in the mess hall took down 4 Marines before they were put down. They're getting stronger, smarter. Jake looked at the schematic. Red zones pulsed where biobreaches had been reported. The direct path to the secondary hangar bay was a sea of red. We can't go the main route. I know, Lena said. That's why I came to you. You know the guts of this place. Jake's mind, so used to tracing schematics, kicked into gear. He pointed to a thin dotted line that snaked through the station's infrastructure. The primary maintenance crawl space. It runs parallel to the main spine of the station. It's tight, it's dark, and it's probably full of dust bunnies the size of house cats. But it bypasses most of the compromised sectors. It'll get us to the hangar's engineering junction. Can we fit? We'll have to, Jake said grimly. Let's gear up. We'll need power packs, a cutting torch, and sidearms if we can find them. They raided a deserted security locker, finding 2 standard plasma pistols. Jake checked the charge on one. It felt heavy and unfamiliar in his hand. He was a man who fixed things, not broke them. But the world where that distinction mattered was gone. He also grabbed his old tool belt, a comforting weight around his waist. He slung a heavy-duty power pack over his shoulder. The entrance to the maintenance crawl space was a small, unassuming panel behind a water reclamation unit. Jake pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a dark, square hole that smelled of dust and old wiring. Ladies first, he said with a humor he didn't feel. Lena gave him a wry look and slid into the darkness. Jake followed, pulling the panel shut behind them. The blackness was absolute. He switched on the headlamp mounted to his helmet, its beam cutting a small, dusty circle in the oppressive dark. The crawl space was even tighter than he remembered. They had to move on their hands and knees, the metal scraping against their jumpsuits. It was claustrophobic, a metal coffin that stretched for miles. They moved in silence for what felt like an hour. The only sounds their own breathing and the scuttling of unseen vermin. The throbbing in Jake's arm was a steady drumbeat of fear. He felt a strange heat spreading from the wound, a feverish warmth that had nothing to do with the stuffy air in the crawl space. He didn't tell Lena. There was no point. Suddenly, a loud banging echoed from below them. It was coming from the corridor they were crawling over. It was a frantic, rhythmic pounding. Then came a scream, cut short by a wet, tearing sound. Lena froze in front of him, her body rigid. They both held their breath, listening. They could hear guttural snarls and the sickening crunch of bone. The Marines in that sector were being overrun. "Keep moving," Jake whispered, his voice tight. They crawled faster, the sounds of the slaughter fading behind them. Jake tried not to think about the men dying below. He had to focus on the schematic in his head, on the next junction, the next turn. They reached a section where the crawl space ran directly over the detention block, the place where it all started. A low, continuous gurgling sound rose from the floor plates. It was the Caithar, the devolved reptilian things they had become. Jake felt a pang of something that was almost pity. They were the first victims of humanity's terrible new secret. He felt a wave of dizziness, and the beam from his headlamp wavered. His bandaged arm was on fire. "Jake?" Lena's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he lied, gritting his teeth, "just tired." But he wasn't fine. The heat was spreading up his arm into his shoulder. He could feel a strange pressure building behind his eyes. The nanites. They were working, fighting his immune system, rewriting his cells one by one. The chaos was building inside him. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on, how much longer he would be Jake. "The engineering junction is just ahead," he said, forcing himself to focus. "We're almost there." But as his headlamp beam swept forward, it fell on something blocking the tunnel. It was a body, a Marine wedged into the tight space, his back to them. He was unnaturally still. "Hello," Lena called out softly. "Are you okay?" The body didn't move. Jake felt a cold certainty. "Don't get any closer," he warned. The Marine's head slowly turned. It turned further than a human neck should be able to, twisting around with a soft crackle of vertebrae. Its face was a pale, distorted mask, but its eyes glowed with a faint predatory light in the darkness of the tunnel. It wasn't dead. It was waiting. It opened its mouth and a low, chittering sound emerged, a sound that was half insect, half reptile. It began to pull its limbs free, its joints bending at impossible angles to navigate the narrow space. It was coming for them. The thing in the crawl space moved with a horrifying spider-like grace. It wasn't shambling and clumsy like Davies had been. It was sleek, adapted to the narrow confines, its body contorting as it scuttled toward them. The Eden Protocol was a fast learner. "Back!" Jake yelled, pushing Lena behind him. "Go back!" There was nowhere to go. They were trapped in a metal tube with a monster. Jake raised his plasma pistol, his hands slick with sweat. The beam from his headlamp illuminated the creature's face as it drew closer. It was Sergeant Miller, a man Jake had played cards with. Now his face was stretched over a skull that was subtly wrong, his eyes wide and black, his mouth a thin, lipless slit. Jake fired. The bolt of plasma struck the creature in the chest, leaving a sizzling, cauterized hole. It shrieked, a high-pitched sound that grated on the ears. But it didn't stop. It just came faster. Lena fired too, her shot going wide in the tight space and ricocheting off the metal walls with a deafening clang. Jake fired again, this time aiming for the head. The shot connected, and the creature's head exploded in a shower of vaporized flesh and blue energy. The body spasmed and went limp, slumping to the floor of the crawl space. For a moment, they just knelt there, their breath ragged, the smell of ozone and cooked meat filling the air. "We have to go over it," Jake said, his voice trembling. There was no room to go around. He took a deep breath and began to crawl forward, his gaze fixed on the headless corpse. He had to climb over the body of a man he knew, a man he had just killed. As his hand touched the creature's back, he recoiled. The skin was cold and rubbery, like a frog's. He swallowed his revulsion and pulled himself over it, trying not to think. Lena followed, her face pale and grim. The fever in Jake's arm was raging now. Black spots danced in his vision. The pressure behind his eyes was immense, a throbbing headache that threatened to split his skull open. He could feel it now, the change. A subtle popping in his joints, a strange tingling in his spine. He was losing the fight. They finally reached the junction and tumbled out of the crawl space into the hangar's engineering room. The space was large and filled with the low hum of the hangar's life support systems. Freedom from the crawl space felt like breaking the surface after being held underwater for too long. But they weren't safe. The main door to the hangar bay was sealed, a heavy blast door. "The control panel is over there," Lena said, pointing. "I can override the lockdown, but I'll need to splice into the main power conduit to give the Nomad systems a jump start." "I'll cover the door," Jake said, taking up a position. He leaned against a wall, trying to control his breathing, trying to fight the sickness that was consuming him. He watched Lena work, her fingers flying across the panel. She was their only hope. He glanced at his own hand, the one on his injured arm. The skin seemed darker, the veins standing out in a thick black web. He flexed his fingers. They felt stiff, foreign. The fingernails were definitely thicker. He was running out of time. A loud metallic bang echoed from the blast door. "Lena, how's it going?" Jake called out, his voice strained. "Almost there. The door's security is military grade. Just a few more seconds," she replied, not looking up from her work. The banging grew more frantic, more powerful. The thick metal of the door began to dent inward. It wasn't one of the creatures. This was something stronger. Something with intelligence behind the rage. With a final deafening screech of tortured metal, the blast door was ripped from its hinges and thrown across the room as if it were a piece of cardboard. Standing in the mangled doorway, silhouetted against the emergency lights of the corridor, was Colonel Eva Rostova, or what was left of her. She was still recognizable. She still wore the tattered remains of her uniform. But she was taller, her limbs elongated and powerful. Her skin was a patchwork of pale human flesh, and a hard, chitinous black armor that had grown over her torso and arms. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, her eyes glowing with a cold blue light. Unlike the other devolved, she hadn't lost her intelligence. She had kept it. She was a fusion of human intellect and monstrous primal power. "Traitors," she hissed, her voice a chilling blend of her own and something deeper, more resonant. "You cannot be allowed to escape. The Eden Protocol is not a mistake. It is a purification, a glorious, necessary evolution. You will not interfere with humanity's ascension." She took a step into the room, her clawed feet clicking on the deck. She wasn't a mindless beast. She was a zealot, a prophet for a new, horrifying kind of life. And she was standing between them and their only way out. "Colonel Rostova," the monster in the uniform moved with a terrifying purpose. She wasn't a snarling beast. She was a predator who knew exactly what she was doing. Her glowing blue eyes swept the room, assessing, calculating. They locked onto Lena, who was still frantically working at the control panel. "The communications officer." Rostova's distorted voice rasped. "The one who broke the seals. You are a disease in the system. You must be purged." She started toward Lena, her movements unnaturally fast. Jake raised his pistol and fired. The plasma bolt struck Rostova's shoulder, but it didn't punch through. It sizzled against the black, chitinous armor, which glowed for a second and then faded. The armor was regenerative. Rostova barely flinched. She turned her head, her gaze falling on Jake. It was a look of cold, analytical contempt. "The technician, the broken variable. You are infected, yet you resist the change. A flaw in the design you must be studied, and then dismantled." She changed direction, coming for Jake instead. He fired again and again, backing away, but the plasma bolt splashed harmlessly off her armored torso. He was shooting spitballs at a tank. "Jake, I need 30 more seconds," Lena yelled, her voice strained with panic. 30 seconds. An eternity. Jake scrambled backward, his heel catching on a loose cable. He stumbled and Rostova was on him. A clawed hand, impossibly strong, clamped around his throat, lifting him off the floor. His feet dangled in the air. He choked, clawing uselessly at her armored wrist. "Look at you," she hissed, her face inches from his. He could see his own terrified reflection in her cold, blue eyes. "Fighting so hard to remain weak, to cling to your fragile, obsolete form. Can't you feel the power in this change? The purity? We are shedding our sentimentality, our flaws. We are becoming what we were always meant to be. Perfect, unstoppable." The pressure on his throat was immense. His vision started to tunnel. The fever in his body, which he had been fighting to control, suddenly exploded. The nanites, under the stress of his near death, went into overdrive. A wave of agony and ecstasy washed over him. He felt his bones pop, his muscles twist. The pain in his arm became a fire that consumed his entire body. He let out a scream, but it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, rougher, a guttural roar. Rostova looked surprised, her grip loosening for a fraction of a second. "Ah, the flaw is correcting itself. You are finally embracing the gift." But she was wrong. It wasn't the same. Jake could feel the chaos inside him, but he could also feel his own consciousness, his own terror, fighting back. He wasn't being erased. He was being twisted. His mind, the mind of Jake the maintenance tech, was still there, trapped in a body at war with itself. He channeled the wave of agonizing energy. His free hand, his uninjured one, shot out and grabbed a thick power conduit running along the wall. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled, monstrous strength, he ripped it free from its moorings. Sparks flew. Alarms blared. "The main power conduit," Lena screamed. "Jake, don't." Rostova's eyes widened as she saw the frayed sparking cable in Jake's hand. She tried to throw him aside, but it was too late. Jake jammed the live end of the conduit directly into the unarmored, still human flesh of her side. 1,000,000 volts of raw power surged into her. She shrieked, a sound that was no longer human or monster, but pure, agonizing energy. Her entire body lit up from the inside, the blue glow in her eyes turning into a blinding white. The chitinous armor cracked and exploded outward. She convulsed violently, her grip on Jake's throat releasing. Jake fell to the floor, gasping for air, as the electrified body of Colonel Rostova collapsed in a smoldering, twitching heap. He lay there, his own body shaking uncontrollably. He looked at his hands. The right one, the one that had held the cable, was burned and raw. The left one, the infected one, was worse. The skin was grey and mottled. The fingers were longer, the nails thicker, almost like claws. The change was accelerating. He could feel it. The monster was winning. "Jake!" Lena was by his side, pulling him up. "The hangar door is open. The Nomad is powered up. We have to go, now." He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady. The world was a dizzying, feverish blur. He looked back at the smoking corpse of the colonel, then at his own monstrous hand. Rostova had called it an ascension, a purification. But it wasn't. It was just a different kind of cage. "Come on," he grunted, his new, rougher voice startling him. He followed Lena through the now open blast door into the hangar bay. The SSV Nomad sat there, small and sleek, its landing ramp down. It was a promise of escape, a promise of survival. But as Jake looked at his changing body, he knew that for him, the horror was far from over. He was taking the monster with him. The ramp of the SSV Nomad hissed shut behind them, sealing them inside the small ship. The silence was sudden and profound, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Lena scrambled into the cockpit, her fingers flying over the pre-flight controls. The ship hummed to life around them, its systems waking from their long slumber. Jake collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and the terrifying metamorphosis still racking his frame. He looked at his left arm. The sleeve of his jumpsuit was shredded. The arm beneath was no longer entirely human. The skin was a tough gray hide, and the muscles had reformed into thick, corded bands. His hand was a claw. He could feel the changes spreading, a slow, relentless tide of corruption moving through him. "Strap in," Lena said, her voice tense. "I'm taking us out." The ship's engines whined, and a gentle vibration ran through the deck. Through the cockpit's viewport, Jake watched the hangar bay fall away as the Nomad lifted off. Lena skillfully maneuvered the small craft out of the hangar and into the black, star-dusted void of space. Below them, Outpost Epsilon was a silent, pockmarked sphere against the backdrop of its gas giant parent. A tomb adrift in the darkness. "Countdown clock for Protocol Scythe is at T-2 minutes, Lena said, her eyes glued to her console. "We need to be clear of the blast radius." She pushed the thrusters to maximum, and the little ship surged forward, pressing Jake back into his seat. He watched the outpost shrink until it was just another point of light. He thought of the bodies left behind. Davies, Miller, Rostova, the devolved Caithar slithering through the silent corridors. All of them victims of a secret so terrible. Their own government had decided to burn them to ash rather than let it be known. Right on schedule. A brilliant, silent flash of light erupted where the outpost had been. It was brighter than a star, a man-made sun that blossomed for a second and then vanished, leaving nothing behind. Not even dust. 20 Scythe was complete. The evidence was erased. Except for them. Lena let out a long, shuddering breath and eased back on the thrusters. The ship settled into a quiet, steady coast through the cosmos. They were alive. They had escaped. Jake looked at his reflection in the dark plexiglass of the viewport. The left side of his face was beginning to distort. The skin pulled taut over cheekbones that were reshaping themselves. One of his eyes was darker than the other. He was a freak, a monster. The living, breathing proof of the Eden Protocol. "What now?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Lena turned to look at him. For the first time he saw the full weight of what they had been through in her eyes. But there was no fear of him. Only a deep, shared sorrow. "Now we warned them," she said softly. "We can't go back to Alliance space. They'd kill us on sight, or worse, put us in a lab for the rest of our lives. And we can't go to the Cathar. They'd see what humanity did, what you're becoming, and they'd start a war that would burn the entire galaxy." She keyed a command into the navigation computer. A star chart appeared, showing their position on the far, uncharted rim of the galaxy. "There are other species out there," she continued, her voice gaining a steely resolve. "Neutral worlds. Independent colonies. We have the data logs from the outpost. We have the specs for the Eden Protocol. And we have the proof." Jake looked down at his clawed hand, at the monstrous transformation that was slowly claiming him. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a message. He was a warning. They were a tiny ship in an infinite, uncaring ocean of stars. They had no allies, no home, and a secret that could shatter civilizations. They were fugitives, hunted by their own kind, carrying a truth that no one wanted to hear. The biowar hadn't ended with the destruction of Outpost Epsilon. It had just begun, and they were on the front line. Humanity had a weapon that could peel back evolution, that could turn its enemies into mindless beasts. For 10 years the galaxy had fought a species. It thought it understood. They were wrong. They had no idea of the true horror humanity was capable of. They didn't know that humans could reverse time itself, one cell at a time. Not until now, the universe was about to learn a terrible new fear. And Jake, the maintenance tech from a forgotten outpost, was going to be its teacher.